Before Uber spent $12 billion solving it, New York had already solved it. No app, no GPS, no algorithm. A woman in a gray wool coat steps from the lobby of an office building at 44th Street, Lexington Avenue, reaches the curb, and raises her right arm. Not a wave, not an appeal. Just an arm extended at a slight angle above the traffic, held there with the specific patience of someone who has done this before and knows what it means. 30 feet north, a cab rounds the corner from 45th Street. The driver has been working this stretch of Lexington since 9 in the morning. He scans the avenue the way he always does, not looking at any single point but reading the whole block at once, the way you read a sentence rather than a letter. He sees the arm. The medallion number on his rooftop is lit. He is empty. He pulls over. The door opens, she says. 57th and Madison. He pulls the flag on the meter. In the city's accounting, a fair has begun. What happened in those 12 seconds is not complicated. A woman needed to cross the city to a meeting. A driver needed a passenger. Both were operating in full view of each other on the same public street. No phone call, no dispatch, no reservation. The supply and the demand found each other in real time, the way they had been finding each other on the avenues of Manhattan since the metered taxi first appeared in the city at the beginning of the century. But what looks simple on the surface is a system, one that required the right vehicle, the right regulatory structure, the right driver, and a city built in a specific way that made the whole arrangement possible. The raised arm worked in Midtown Manhattan in 1968 because thousands of cabs were in continuous circulation across the same grid, because the driver had a lit rooftop that told the world he was empty, because the city's avenue grid kept traffic moving north and south in identifiable lanes, and because a meter in the cab translated the distance into a price that both parties understood before the door closed. The woman in the gray coat did not know any of this. She knew that she needed to be at 57th and Madison by 12:30, that the subway did not serve her well on a crosstown trip, and that an arm raised at Lexington and 44th had a good chance of producing a cab. She was right. But what produced that cab? What made raising an arm on a Manhattan avenue a reasonable strategy for crossing the city is a story that begins with the vehicle and the system, moves through the driver and what he knew, and ends somewhere in the specific daily motion of a city that used the street-hail cab as one of its primary instruments of movement. Where exactly does it begin? A rooftop light on a New York City taxi in this period was a simple device that performed a complex social function. The lit medallion number in the center panel meant one thing: the cab was empty and available for hire. The dark number meant occupied. The outer, off-duty panels, controlled by a manual switch on the dashboard, told a different story: available, but choosing not to stop. A passenger scanning the avenue had to read all three states simultaneously. Lit center, dark sides, take your arm down, it is already taken. Dark center, occupied, keep waiting. Lit center, lit sides, the driver is finished for the shift and heading to the garage. What looked like a light on a roof was a public information system running continuously in real time across miles of Midtown Avenue. The driver's side of this system was not the light. The light was a signal of status. The actual work was the scan. A driver who had been working Lexington or 7th or 5th Avenue for any length of time had developed a read of the block that went beyond the arm in the air. Published accounts of cab driving in this period describe consistently a driver awareness of the curb that could identify a likely fare from a significant distance, the angle of the arm, whether the person was looking uptown or downtown, whether they were holding anything that suggested a longer trip or a shorter one. The meter started when the driver pulled the flag. Everything before that moment was judgment, the driver's accumulated read of the city at that particular hour on that particular block. The exchange through the partition, the destination given in a few words, the meter started, the cab pulling into traffic was the entire formal transaction, and it was brief. What the passenger said when the door closed was the beginning of the driver's route decision, and the route decision was where the knowledge lived. Not the start of the meter, not the destination itself, but the specific question at this hour on this day, with the office buildings beginning to empty to the east and the delivery traffic backing up on 7th, of how to get there. The crosstown trip was the system's specific advantage. Manhattan's subway grid runs predominantly north and south. A passenger who needed to move from the east side to the west side, from Lexington to 7th in midday traffic, or from 5th to 8th after the theater let out, had very few alternatives to the street hail cab. The arm went up. The lit light came toward them. The cab handled what the subway grid could not. What did it take to make that possible? Before we go further, if this kind of documentation matters to you, consider subscribing. Every video here goes into one specific aspect of American cab culture: the vehicle, the shift, the medallion, the dispatch, and the specific knowledge of the driver who knew their city in a way that no app has replicated. A cab driver who had been working Midtown for 7 years knew which office buildings emptied early on Fridays, which blocks backed up before you could see the traffic, and which intersections were always clear knowledge that has never been in a routing algorithm and cannot be. And if you drove a cab in this era, or your family did, leave it in the comments. If you drove a cab in Manhattan in this era, or your family did, what block or what hour do you remember? Which avenue, which shift, which kind of fare taught you something about the city that you couldn't have read on a map? Next on this channel, the medallion. What the number on the hood of that checker actually cost, who owned it and who didn't, and what the economics of that plate produced in 40 years of New York's working life. Back to the cab, the vehicle that stopped when the arm went up, in the decade that produced the most enduring image of the Manhattan street hail, was more likely than not a Checker Marathon. The Checker A11, the fleet taxi designation for the commercial version of the Marathon, operating under that chassis code from 1963 onward, was not designed to be comfortable. It was designed to last. The body-on-chassis construction that most American automakers had abandoned by the late 1950s in favor of lighter unibody designs was, for Checker Motors in Kalamazoo, Michigan, exactly the right choice for a vehicle that was going to be driven 12 to 18 hours a day on the streets of New York. The A11 had a 120-inch wheelbase, jump seats in the passenger compartment that could accommodate 5 rear passengers, a flat rear floor, and a mechanical simplicity that cab companies could service in their own garages. Accounts of this period document consistently that the Checker Marathon could sustain several 100,000 miles of city service before requiring a major overhaul, a figure that would have been impossible with a standard American passenger sedan of the same era. By the mid-1960s, Checker was producing 6,000 to 8,000 vehicles annually, with the fleet A11 version going primarily to commercial taxi operators in New York and other American cities. The companies that ran large fleets in Midtown preferred the Checker for reasons that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with economics: fewer breakdowns per shift, lower repair costs per mile, and a rear compartment large enough that the jump seats could produce an extra fare from a group sharing a ride across town. The partition, the pane of glass and metal that separated the front seat from the rear, had its own operational character. It was a safety feature, a communication device, and an acoustic barrier simultaneously. Destination through the partition window, payment through the partition on arrival. The driver and the passenger occupied the same vehicle for the duration of the fare and exchanged almost nothing beyond the destination, the route, and the cash. The Checker began to lose market share in the 1970s when Ford, Chevrolet, and Dodge entered the fleet cab market with full-size production sedans that were cheaper to purchase, if not as durable. By 1982, when the last Checker Marathon was manufactured, the New York City cab fleet was already moving towards standard sedans. But for the core years of the street hail system, the 1960s and into the early 1970s, the vehicle that stopped when you raised your arm on a Manhattan avenue was built specifically for that purpose. It was not adapted from a passenger car. It was the cab. What did the driver who worked it know before he pulled over? The driver, who had been working the same Manhattan shift for a number of years, carried a specific and non-transferable intelligence about the city. This is not a romantic claim. It is an operational one, documented consistently in the accounts of cab drivers from this period. Manhattan's Avenue Grid. Fifth, Park, Lexington, Madison, and the numbered avenues running north-south across the island is organized and legible in a way that gives the impression of being easy to navigate. It is not. The one-way streets shift direction block by block across the numbered cross streets and determine everything about how a driver approaches a destination, which lane he needs to be in before the passenger finishes giving the address, which avenue approach opens fastest to a given block, and which blocks trap a cab in delivery traffic before the driver can see it from a distance. A driver working Midtown in 1968 knew not just that 42nd Street ran east and 41st Street ran west, he knew which side of which avenue produced the fastest approach to which building, what time the loading docks on the east side of Park Avenue backed up traffic, and which cross streets in the 40s slowed to a near stop at noon because of the restaurant delivery flow. None of that was on a map. None of it was provided by any regulatory system. The crosstown demand that gave the street hail cab much of its practical value, the east-to-west trips that the subway's predominantly north-south grid could not serve, required a driver who understood not just the destination, but the specific condition of the crosstown streets at the hour the fare was taken. The cross streets in Midtown are narrow. They carry delivery trucks, the pedestrian overflow from the office buildings, and the lateral traffic of passengers trying to reach the opposite side of the island, all simultaneously. A driver who had been working a Midtown shift for several years had accumulated a mental model of those cross streets by hour and by day, which were fast at noon and blocked by 5, which were one way in the wrong direction for the address just given, which building exits produced pedestrian flow at specific times that made a left turn on that block impossible. The fare from Lexington and 44th to 57th and Madison at noon was not the same trip as the same fare at 5:30 in the afternoon. A driver who had made both trips enough times knew the difference before he pulled the flag. That knowledge, the accumulated operational read of the specific hours and avenues of a specific part of the city, is what the street hail system depended on, and it is the thing no regulatory document ever recorded. What did the city's own rhythms require of that knowledge? The density of yellow cabs on a Manhattan avenue was itself information about the city at that hour. By 7:30 in the morning, the Midtown avenues were heavy, with cabs working the incoming office flow, picking up from hotel doorways and apartment buildings on the Upper East and Upper West sides, carrying office workers into the 40s and 50s where they needed to be by 9. The morning was readable. The fares moved in one direction, and a driver who understood the morning knew where to be in that flow, rather than against it. The late afternoon was harder. The shift changed the handoff between the driver finishing a day shift and the driver beginning an evening shift happened consistently around 4 to 5 in the afternoon. For 20 to 30 minutes during that window, cabs that had been visible and available on every block of the avenue were suddenly scarce. Drivers heading back to their garages, flags down, off-duty panels lit, moving through the city toward the lot rather than toward the fare. A passenger standing on Lexington at 4:30 on a weekday encountered a version of the street hail system under genuine pressure cabs passing without stopping, the off-duty panels lit, the available for hire center light dark. The TLC regulated what the driver was required to do. The manual off-duty switch on the dashboard gave the driver a way to signal otherwise. Rain reversed the visible logic of the system entirely. The demand for cabs in rain from passengers who would otherwise walk or take the bus rose sharply, and the supply did not match it. Cabs in the rain moved more slowly. Fares took longer. A driver who had been cycling through 3 or 4 short Midtown fares per hour in clear weather was now running longer rides to fewer destinations. And the cabs that were working were unavailable for the length of a longer trip. A passenger who could reliably raise her arm on Lexington and have a cab stop within 2 minutes on a clear Tuesday might stand in the rain for 10 or 15 minutes on the same block and watch a dozen occupied cabs pass. The Broadway curtain was different, predictable, concentrated, brief. When the theaters on 44th and 45th Streets let out after 10 in the evening, hundreds of people reached the same narrow blocks of the theater corridor at approximately the same moment. A driver who knew that moment, who knew where to be on 7th Avenue at 5 minutes past 10 and which way the crowd would turn, worked that surge rather than arriving at it. What did the formal system understand about any of this? Before you can understand what the street hail system actually was, you need to understand what the regulatory system that governed it provided and what it could not. The number of licensed taxi medallions in New York City was fixed by the City Council in 1937, a response to the Depression-era proliferation of unlicensed vehicles competing for a shrinking passenger market, which had driven down fares, bankrupted licensed operators, and created chaos on the streets. The fix was straightforward. Cap the total number of medallion licenses, establish a regulatory structure, and require any cab legally authorized to accept a street hail to carry the medallion, the aluminum plate affixed to the hood that identified the vehicle as licensed and authorized. That cap remained in place for decades. The fleet working Manhattan's avenues in the 1960s was bounded by a fixed supply that the city had decided upon 30 years earlier. The city that fixed that number in 1937 was not the city of 1,965 or 1,973. The office buildings of Midtown Manhattan, which generated a large portion of the street hail traffic during the core years of the system, had grown substantially in number and density in the intervening decades. The number of people working in those buildings and using cabs to cross the city had grown with them. The fixed medallion supply served a significantly larger demand, which is one reason that medallion prices, which had been approximately $2,500 in 1947, climbed above $30,000 in the mid-1960s. Before the economic recession and fleet sell-offs of the early 1970s drove them back down to approximately $10,000 by 1971. In the late 1960s, the city moved to standardize the visual identity of the licensed fleet. All medallion cabs were required to be painted yellow. On the 2nd of March, 1971, the Taxi and Limousine Commission was created by Local Law 12, replacing the police department as the regulatory authority for the industry. The TLC set fare rates, established vehicle standards, and administered hack licenses to drivers. What the TLC's records showed: medallions issued, violations logged, fare rates published. What the TLC's records could not show: which avenues produced the highest hailing density at which hours, which cross streets became effectively impassable during the afternoon delivery window. What the Broadway theater discharge looked like from the driver's seat at 5 minutes past 10 on a full house. The formal system provided the infrastructure for the street hail to exist. The knowledge that made it function, that told a driver where to be and when, what the city was about to need before the city asked, was distributed across the fleet, one shift at a time, and was not in any record. What happened to the passengers the system did not reach? The street hail system depended on circulation, cabs moving continuously through the areas of the city where demand was highest. In Manhattan's commercial core, the Midtown office district, the theater corridor, the financial district below Chambers Street, that circulation was dense and reliable for much of the working day. But the system's coverage was not uniform across the island, and the places where a raised arm on a Manhattan avenue was least likely to produce a cab were not random. The subway's north-south grid underserved certain crosstown trips, and that gap was filled unevenly by the yellow cab fleet. In the commercial corridors, the stretch of Park and Lexington running through the East 40s and 50s, the blocks around 5th Avenue, 7th Avenue, through the theater district, a pedestrian with a raised arm faced reasonable wait times under most conditions. In the cross streets, and in the neighborhoods north of 59th Street on the east side that generated less continuous cab traffic, and in the neighborhoods of Upper Manhattan that the circulating fleet visited less frequently as the shift progressed. The results were different. Accounts of this period document consistently that cab availability in certain neighborhoods of Upper Manhattan and the outer boroughs was substantially lower than in the Midtown core, not only because fewer cabs circulated there, but because of documented patterns of driver behavior. Licensed yellow cab drivers, authorized by the TLC to serve any passenger who hailed them anywhere in the 5 boroughs, were documented to use the off-duty switch to decline pickups in certain areas. The TLC's regulations required acceptance of all hails. The manual switch on the dashboard gave the driver a mechanism to signal otherwise, and the TLC could not distinguish from its records. A driver who was genuinely ending his shift from one who was declining a specific pickup. The result was a parallel informal transportation economy. The unlicensed gypsy cab operators who served neighborhoods that the licensed yellow fleet passed through without stopping. The city eventually sanctioned and began regulating livery services in 1971, the same year it created the TLC. But the authorized street hail, the lit rooftop, the raised arm, the metered fare remained exclusively available from the yellow medallion cab. No other vehicle on the street could legally stop for an arm in the air. The formal system covered certain parts of Manhattan very well. The gaps it left were filled differently or not filled at all. Who carried that knowledge forward when the drivers who held it moved on? Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the elements of the street hail system began to change not all at once, and not by replacing what had existed, but by layering new capabilities onto the existing practice. GPS routing arrived in cab navigation. In-car credit card terminals for decades. A cash-only transaction became standard equipment. The hack license, the TLC regulations, the medallion on the hood, those remained. But a driver navigating Midtown in 2003 had access to route information that a driver working the same streets in 1968 could only have accumulated through years of the same shift. The routing algorithm could find the fastest path from Lexington and 44th to 57th and Madison. It could account for the current condition of 45th Street at that moment. It could do in seconds what the experienced driver had built over years of the same avenues. What it could not do was what the experienced driver knew before the algorithm had data to process. The routing algorithm knew the current traffic condition. It did not know that the building on the northeast corner of Lexington and 46th produced a specific kind of crosstown demand every Tuesday and Thursday morning that a driver who had worked that block for several years would have positioned himself for before the demand appeared. It did not know that the fastest way across 53rd Street at 11 in the morning was different from the fastest way across 53rd Street at 5:30 in the afternoon, and that the difference was not visible in current traffic data because it was caused not by a visible bottleneck, but by a pattern of pedestrian behavior at a specific building exit that an experienced driver had learned to anticipate. Rather than react to, the algorithm responds to what has already happened. The experienced driver anticipated what was about to happen. App-based hailing arrived in New York City in the early 2010s. A passenger with a smartphone could summon a car to a specific address, watch it approach, and pay without cash. The street hail, the arm raised on the curb, the lit rooftop found and approached remain legal for yellow medallion cabs only. It still works. Raising an arm on a Manhattan Avenue in the mid-2020s can still produce a cab. What it produces is different from what it produced in 1968. Not worse in every respect. Different. The driver who stops has access to route information that the driver in the checker did not. What the driver in the checker had was something the algorithm is still learning to name. If this channel is worth subscribing to, that's how you tell us. The cab driver who knew your city's streets in a way no algorithm has fully replicated yet built that knowledge one shift at a time, over years of the same avenues, until the shift ended and the knowledge went with him. And if you have a cab story from this era, as a driver, as a regular passenger, as someone whose city this was, write it in the comments. If you drove a cab in Manhattan in this era, or your family did, what block or what hour do you remember? Which avenue? Which shift? Which kind of fare? Which city? Which decade? Which shift? The street hail system's last formal operating unit is not a vehicle. It is the lit rooftop number, which still means the same thing it meant in 1953 on a checker on 7th Avenue. The driver is empty, the cab is available. And a raised arm on the curb is an invitation to stop. A driver who worked the Midtown day shift in 1968 retired his hack license with a specific and irreplaceable operational knowledge of the avenues and cross streets of a specific part of New York City. At specific hours of the working day, the TLC log showed shifts completed, violations, none, fares, the fleet average for his period. What the log didn't show, what a crosstown fare from Lexington to 7th required on a rainy afternoon in the fourth quarter. Which buildings on the east side of Midtown generated the most consistent after-lunch hailing and in what direction? What the Broadway theater surge looked like from the driver's seat at 5 minutes past 10 on a full house, and where to be on the avenue before it started. That went with the driver. The next driver who took that shift learned it the way the previous one had learned it. By showing up, by pulling over, by doing it enough times that the avenue stopped being a set of blocks and became a language he could read before the arm went up.